Okay, great. Welcome back. We're going to talk about Indigenous people and hunting. And this is a really important chapter. It's actually chapter 8 in the core manual, but I'd like to talk about this at the front end of our hunting presentation because I think it's so important that we reflect on this and get it right. And I think it's really we're talking a lot about the future of hunting and our relationship with both Indigenous people and the understanding the importance of that relationship as it reflects to shared use of the land and how the land will likely be managed going forward. And I'll kind of get into that here throughout this presentation. But first, whenever I do a workshop or a course, I always open with, or host a meeting, I always open with an acknowledgement, a First Nation acknowledgement. So I'd like to do that here. I'm in Vancouver, and so I am on the, I am very fortunate to be able to live, work, play, and harvest and fish on the traditional territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. And they have lived on these lands for time immemorial, and they have never given up the rights to manage these lands. So they've been stewards of these lands for a very long time, and they've relied on these lands for their way of life to hunt, fish, gather, and they continue to live that life to this day. I feel very fortunate to have found my way here, and I share so many of those values with Indigenous communities around connection to land and a way of life. I'm very fortunate, again, to live in a place where I can continue to practice that way of life, and ultimately I rely on the land to do that. So I acknowledge that I do that on these territories. Now I also acknowledge that I hunt, fish, and gather throughout the province on numerous different territories throughout the province, and I do my best to acknowledge and respect both the land rights of the Indigenous peoples in those traditional territories, and try to respect their Indigenous law around land use. So that's what this chapter is a bit about. It's about trying to come to an understanding of what it means to do a first aid acknowledgement, but more importantly, what it means to access traditional territories throughout the province, and trying to understand a little bit about the changing landscape that we have ahead of us, particularly for hunters that rely on being able to go throughout BC and hunt and gather and and where we're entering into different territories, and there's definitely a changing legal landscape, and there's definitely changing expectations around how we approach this and the importance of relationships with those communities that we are going to be in their territory. So let's get into that a little bit, and I'll walk you through it here. So it's really important. Again, this is chapter 8. And you can review that material. You can read through it. On the right hand side, you can see sort of an image here of British Columbia, and it's broken down into traditional territories, as I kind of mentioned in the acknowledgement in the intro. It's important to recognize first off that there's different types of Indigenous people, different groups, and I think if you're there are a number of First Nations here in British Columbia, different distinct nations. You're familiar with likely obviously the Squamish people if you're in Vancouver here, or Musqueam or Tsleil-Waututh. There's Katzie out towards Quitlam and up into Maple Ridge, and if you go further out in the valley, the Stolo people. There's many nations throughout BC. Across Canada, there's also lots of diversity in the different nations. There's Inuit people in the northern parts of British Columbia, and then of course there's the Métis people, and the Métis people are throughout Canada as well. All of which have distinct rights in Canada, and I'll talk a little bit about those coming up here. So the first piece is to understand what traditional territories are, and if you could think back, of course, to uh, pre-contact, Indigenous groups or nations had to maintain a way of life, whether it was to fish or hunt or gather, and there was an area in which they were able to do that became their territory. Now, these Indigenous communities had their own principles of stewardship and Indigenous law that governed how that land use was governed, or how it was shared amongst the peoples or shared with other nations. And each one of those areas became a sort of best described, or was easily described as a territory. It's sort of like a nation boundary, if you will. Um, the uniqueness, of course, of traditional territories is that it's not just one, you know, one river valley, and it may be expand over several valleys or a larger area, and it might not just be one nation that use that territory. Often territories are shared territories by numerous nations that would use those areas throughout the year for sustenance or a way of life. Um, if you kind of look, I'll kind of point this out in a little bit, but I'll show you some close-ups of that in a second here. When we're talking about Indigenous people, uh, and there's always, and no doubt, even myself, I sort of stumble a little bit as I am very careful as to how I approach this chapter. There's how to talk about this with respect and understanding without overstepping my understanding or without disrespecting Indigenous peoples or the diversity of peoples. And so it often requires trying to stay up to date, or developing a comfort is probably the right word, with the appropriate terms to use. I often say First Nation people or First Nation government, as it relates to uh, a government. If I'm an Indigenous person, is how I'm most comfortable referring to someone who is Indigenous. But probably the most important thing of all this is that if you are working with a nation, or if you're engaging with an Indigenous person, is to ask how they would most like to be addressed. What's the appropriate term for describing or relaying to that individual or to that group, and in all my experience, uh, the nation or the individuals have been more than willing to share what they most feel comfortable, and the best appropriate term to describe their community or the individuals within their community. Is another really important term that you no doubt hear, if you're in Canada. We've talked a lot about reconciliation, and most recently there's the um, there's an awakening here in Canada as to the impacts of residential schools on Indigenous people. That dark story has been at the forefront of with most Canadians currently, with the discovery of thousands of children that were buried in and around residential schools, and those unmarked graves are now being uh, identified, and that story has been something that's we've all been having to come to grips with as Canadians and understand, and truly start to feel and experience just how tragic this story is, and only begin to understand the impact it's had on these Indigenous communities as a result of residential schools. The 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 way forward is to find a way towards reconciliation. The way forward is to try and understand that story and take steps to help heal as a nation, and that's a long process, and it's a difficult process, and I'm not here to try and explain what that's going to look like, or what those steps might be. But I think it's important that we understand that there's tremendous impacts that happen to Indigenous peoples and communities as a result of the colonization of Canada, and and no doubt doesn't if you and you should research what those impacts were, are, and continue to be today, and how they manifest themselves today in our society and in First Nation communities, and do your part to first understand the history of it, and then do your part to be part of reconciliation, and doing your best to uh, find a way forward in this place we call Canada. So that's what reconciliation is about, in the most in my best possible way to try and explain a very complex thing. And again, it's something that we need to be comfortable with, and at least talking about. Something I'm a little bit more comfortable talking about because it's part of my work in park management and land management is consultation, and you'll hear this word a lot when it comes to development on in land on crown land here in BC, or in my case in provincial parks. Um, there's a responsibility by government to consult with First Nations before any authorization on the crown land is allowed. So if someone wants a permit to build a golf course on crown land, there would be a requirement to consult with First Nations whose traditional territory, sorry, where the golf course might be located within a traditional territory. The nations whose traditional territory that is would be consulted by government to say, hey, this developer would like to build a golf course. There's economic opportunity and benefit for this golf course. How would this golf course? The question would be to the nations: how would this golf course impact your rights and title as your First Nation rights and title that are protected under the Canadian Constitution? Now, an example of that might be that the nation might say, "Hey, that's mule deer winter range that we rely on for to hunt and gather food, and therefore that golf course would have an impact to us." Or in this day and age too, it's more likely that the communities would be like, "Well, hey, like I realize you want to build a golf course there, but we'd like to build a school there, or we'd like to build housing for Indigenous for band members." There's lots of complicated things that'll come with that. So the move forward is changing quite a bit, and how the role of First Nation people and then at the role of the responsibility for consultation and the role that First Nation people have in governance and land stewardship, and that's changing quite rapidly. And more and more, we're seeing the Indigenous governments at the table as part of the decision making process and part of the planning of any large scale development here in BC. All right, so I've got a bit of a slide up here on traditional territories. You can see that this is kind of interesting. You can see sort of closer to the Salish Sea here in and around Vancouver Island and Vancouver. There's a higher density of territories, and this is kind of, from my understanding of this, is because uh, with the annual salmon runs, these areas were incredibly rich, and so a large community could be sustained by the richness of the salmon run and all the other fisheries that were present here throughout the Salish Sea. So very much a productive area. Now, if you look out sort of into the interior BC, with Okanagan, Stoney, the Slocatin, much bigger tracts of land that represent the traditional territory, and that's largely my understanding, partly because you would need a larger area to hunt and gather to sustain over the course of the year. So the nations really were stewards over a much larger area, maybe lower density communities over a larger area, whereas closer to, in my understanding is, in and around the rivers here in the south coast area, there was a very high density of peoples living on the richness of those areas. So that's one example. And then, of course, as you go further up north, like Tahltan and Sekani and the Dinaza, much larger territories again. But again, any part of British Columbia, there would have been a nation relying on those lands for sustenance, and therefore those are traditional territories to this day. And so it's important to recognize that anywhere you hunt in BC, you're going to be hunting on a traditional territory of one nation or multiple First Nations. Now, one of the reasons why we talk so much about land management and the changing role of First Nations in land management, I think if you go anywhere in BC, you'd just be sort of stunned at the impacts that our current stewardship practices have had on the land. And I think I use the word stewardship, very loosely here, because this to me doesn't look like good land stewardship. This is the current forestry practices in British Columbia have resulted in these types of landscapes over and over in British Columbia, where we fragmented all the forest, taken off all that habitat, and left behind clear cuts. And those clear cuts, have impacts on fisheries, a great impact on fisheries, have a great impact on biodiversity and wildlife values, and ultimately, we're seeing devastatingly no numbers of fish and wildlife here in BC, and it's largely because of the industrial development we've seen across the landscape, as well as climate change has played a role as well. So I have a lot of time when a First Nation comes forward and says, "Hey, we want to play a role in land management. We've always been stewards of these lands, and we want to participate in land management." And quite frankly, in you could point to some of these, some of our land management principles and say, hey, yeah, we haven't done a great job of protecting, wildlife values and fisheries values, which are incredibly important to me as a hunter and a fisher, and certainly important to people who've relied on those resources to survive for for well over 10,000 years. So while I realize forestry is important in BC, it feeds lots of families. It's a huge part of our industry. Uh, it's also not the only value that we need to be managing for, and I think we got to do a better job of it. And I think we can do it with the. I think it's time for First Nations to be at the table to help guide those future land making decisions. So some of the things you'll see as sort of steps towards reconciliation in a park management sense, we many of the parks we're acknowledging the First Nations or the traditional uses of a park or an area by acknowledging it with an Indigenous name. You'll see that as you go through the province. So lots of good stories here, and one of the things that I found as a park manager, as I've got to know the communities and whose traditional territories I'm managing parks in, there's so much more to these parks and these places when you start to look at it through the lens of Indigenous traditional land use and the stories and the values that are actually protected in those parks. It's not just necessarily a place to go kayaking or hiking. There's incredible archaeology and cultural uses that when you open up the opportunity to hear those stories, it's just incredible, the history of these lands and how they've supported people in so many different ways over time immemorial. So it's really a great story, and I really value that part of my job. Okay, so some key terms that you'll need to know as you get more comfortable and having these conversations, as well as some of these components are on the test as well. So it's important to understand the different types of rights. We have First Nations have inherent rights. Now these are pre-contact rights to the way of life prior to settlement. So inherent rights are like rights to fish and hunt and gather. Those are things that have never been taken away from Indigenous people, nor and still exist to this day. And inherent rights to their way of life. Uh, Aboriginal rights is a legal term. It's defined in Canadian law, and it confirms many inherent rights. So you'll often hear that Indigenous people have the Aboriginal right uh, uh, to harvest for food and ceremonial purposes, and that's an Aboriginal right protected under the Canadian Constitution. There it is. So the right to hunt, fish, and gather for sustenance and ceremonial purposes. So this is a great example. So in you in some parts of BC, or say some parks, there's no hunting in some parks or some times of the year in parks. However, if provided there's no impacts to the wildlife population, uh, Indigenous people can hunt outside of what we would call a regular hunting season, or say in an area that wouldn't allow hunting, say like a park. Um, you know, there's two factors that might require further conversations or finding solutions to how we could best do it so it's both safe and doesn't have an impact on the wildlife values. So there's two pieces there. So I work with a number of nations, and I often will get requests from a nation, or well, requests. I'll be probably better yet. I should probably say I'm notified by a nation that there's a plan to hunt in a specific part of the park, and those conversations are generally positive, and it's more about, how can we make sure we do that safely so there's no impact to the public safety. And secondly, with consultation with biologists and others, can we make sure that hunt happens without having any impact to the wildlife values over, that, so that there's a sustainable population that can stay in the hunt. And generally speaking, in my experience, the nations that I work with generally have more information on the health of the wildlife populations in and around their communities. So they're making those decisions knowing that there is a healthy population, therefore they can hunt. And really, it's about safety beyond that. So that's an example of where an Aboriginal right might be, where I might, as a park manager, run into an Aboriginal right to hunt. Now, there's another example of rights, and this is a little bit more modern in some places, which is that treaty rights. There's modern day treaties, like say for instance, the Tsawwassen First Nation have a modern day treaty, and if you've been out to the Tsawwassen Ferry Terminal in the last 10 years, you'll notice lots of changes. And what happened there is there's been like a long discussion between the federal government, the provincial government, and the Tsawwassen Nation around reestablishing their rights, their title over the lands which they have, where in and around where they live down in the Tsawwassen area. And those rights were confirmed as treaty rights, and large areas of land were then essentially given back to the nation to govern, and they were able to start to develop those lands. So there's all kinds of infrastructure, housing developments in the area. There's mall developments. There's a lot of economic development in and around the Tsawwassen area, and that's all to the benefit of the Tsawwassen Nation. And you can see that area has really developed and taken off. So that's an example of where modern treaty rights. The Tla'amin people in north of Powell River have a modern treaty, and there's been some big changes and benefit to the community there. And there's older treaties, such as Sechelt has an older treaty, and a number of treaty nations. Now, I think probably I could probably safely say the majority of nations around BC do not have modern day treaties. They in some cases they're still in what's called a treaty process, where they're negotiating with government to for a treaty, and that's something that's processing along. That's negotiating and a process. And then some nations are actually just looking to the courts to settle the land use discussion and land management discussion. One good example is the Slocoteen decision, where the Chilcotin Nation, Hanikatine, have been in court with Canada for, I think, upwards of 80 years, trying to re-establish their title, their ownership of the land, and I'll talk about that shortly. So that's sort of the nut of it, is like that there's the Aboriginal title to land, like the land ownership, the right to manage that land for exclusive use of the nation, and they can decide how to manage the land and who can come and go and who can hunt on the land. So there's some areas of BC that are Aboriginal title land, and those are typically as a result of treaty rights or treaty negotiations. Hunting rights, and that's the rights to harvest. Those are the main rights that we would sort of bump into, or you'd hear about in the news or in these discussions or read about. I like this slide because I was this is on a sort of a sheep caribou hunt a few years ago, and I found this spot, and you kind of see that rock down to the left there, just on the corner of the screen, and I sort of huddled behind that rock because I'm out of the wind, but I can still see this gorgeous valley, and I'm sitting there and I'm watching. I can see caribou wandering across this flat up above me. I can see sheep up on the mountains, and I'm kind of just I sit with my binoculars and tucked out of the wind, and I look down between my feet, and there's this like beautifully formed arrowhead. And it's actually more of a spearhead. It's quite large. And I looked it up. I was like, that's gorgeous, but like, it's sort of weird that someone would drop this here. And my mind went to like some kid had a replica spearhead and somehow left it here. And that's where my mind went initially, and then like I just like snapped out of it. I was like, oh wait, that's that's a projectile point, that's a spear point, and I'm sitting in the exact place that indigenous hunters would have sat and done the exact same thing that I'm doing. Sitting here out of the wind, watching caribou and sheep, trying to pick out which the next step would be to potentially have a successful harvest, and either drop their spear point there, or I suspect they were probably working on it, and maybe it didn't pass inspection, so they left it there and hopefully went off and had a successful hunt with a better formed spear point. But I guess the point that why that I found that so profound is I'm in the middle of nowhere, clearly, uh, but it's so profound because this the question of land and the values and protecting the land. I mean, that hunter, God knows, could have been 200 years ago, could have been 2,000 years ago. Uh, feels incredibly probably felt incredibly strongly about their ability to continue to harvest on these landscapes and sustain their way of life. I feel that same thing. I every time I see, you know, intact wilderness, I know that there's a hope that I can continue to connect with land and harvest from the land. And as I looked at those slides from before, where the land has been devastated, like by logging, and how that like that way of life is taken away from people when you take away the land. And for indigenous people, across Canada, the land was taken away from them. Their way of life was taken away. And as a hunter, and you're a hunter, and you're going to be a hunter, and you're going to have a better insight into what's happened to indigenous people than the average person. And you're also going to be at the front line of what it means to work through reconciliation, to move back towards a place where indigenous people have reestablished their title, their Aboriginal title, their Aboriginal use of the land. And it will have an impact on us as hunters, because um, there's going to be a changing discussion as to who has the right to be on the land. And but I do encourage you to approach that with an open heart and an open mind, because we're going to be part of that discussion, and the impacts are going to impact all hunters here in BC. All right, this is an important one. I talked about treaty rights and title to land as a result of treaty. This one here is a uh, where the nation went through the courts. This is the Slocatin Nation decision, where they were in court for 80 years and eventually got the court decided that yes, they have not given up the right to manage their land, and those lands are now have been granted title back to the Slocatin people, and it's really changed the access here. So I was actually looking at hunting in this area this year, and part of that process for me is I gonna call the band office and ask for permission to transit the Slocatin Nation territory, and I'm seeking permission. And it's a different process. So that's very different than accessing the majority of the rest of BC, where um, you can still hunt on traditional territories. Uh, there's probably we're heading in the direction of a courtesy to the nations to ask for permission, or ask for um, permission is not the right word, because I think that insinuates that there's title within the traditional territories. There is what's important to, I guess what I'm trying to say is that for areas where title has not been granted, but there's still a traditional territory, there are still rights within that territory, and those nations still hunt in those areas. So it's important uh, to do some research before you go. And part of that is to go on the website, try to understand where the traditional territory is that you're going into. See if there's any requests to hunters, if there are areas that they feel strongly that should be closed or should be no harvest areas. See if there's any information on their website, and you can go that extra step, and you can call the band office or a contact point if they provide it on the website to see if there's and to share what your plans are and see if you can get any feedback from the nation as to, maybe where you should or shouldn't be hunting within the traditional territory. Maybe they have some insight for you. But I think that's a process that we're heading towards. It's not required at this point, but it's certainly a practice that I've been incorporating into my own approach to hunting. It's just reaching out to those nations and trying to get more information around the territory that I'm hunting in, particularly from an Indigenous perspective and an Indigenous land management perspective. All right, I'll move on. So it's important for you when it comes to land designations here as to understand where you're allowed to hunt. So I'm just going to use my little cursor here. So land designations of Crown land, you do not need permission at this time to hunt on Crown land. So that's good news, and I hope it stays that way. Obviously, private land, whether it's First Nation private land or whether it's um, anybody else's private land, you do need permission to hunt on those properties. And you need to get it in writing. It's probably the smartest move. Often if you're asking for, whoops, I'm just going to jump back here. You want to get that permission in writing. Parkland, you can check the website, BC Parks website, to see if you're allowed to hunt on in that park. Many provincial parks you can hunt in. Pretty much no federal parks allow or national parks allow for hunting. Indian reserve land, you would require permission for sure. Traditional territories, I have consideration here, and I kind of hit on that before. I think you should consider notifying or asking. I like the idea of checking the website, and I think maybe we're going to head in that direction where nations can post information to hunters on their website. I don't think most nations can handle the volume of requests from hunters if every hunter was to ask permission or seek guidance from each nation where they're hunting. But I think it's something that we need to be talking about and being aware of. Lastly, treaty settlement lands or Aboriginal title lands. Yes, you do need permission to hunt on those lands. Now, what I should do is I should guide you towards a couple of podcasts that I did with my friend Spencer Greening. Spencer is a Tsimshian First Nation person, and he's a great speaker. He's an academic, and he's working towards his doctorate in under, understanding and sort of the modern perspectives of Indigenous land stewardship and sort of tying traditional land stewardship to modern day stewardship practices and being at the center of that conversation. So he's been on my podcast a couple times. He's an amazing speaker and an amazing person, and he's definitely going to be a leader for all of us going forward as we better understand how we're going to move forward. What amounts to a very complex and unique process going forward. But I find those podcasts with Spencer, and you'll certainly be in a good place to help best understand both the Indigenous perspective and a way forward, which I'm excited about. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and move on.